Hello, my name's Andrew, and today we're doing a long-term review of the Vivo Barefoot GOBI Boot Winter Edition. So back when I got these, they were called the winterized, and now they're called the warmlined, but they're essentially the same thing as far as I can tell. And they're my favorite winter barefoot boots for snow and slush and all kinds of stuff because they've got a leather upper. It's very water resistant. You can see it's got kind of a sheen to it, so the water just kind of like slides straight off the top. And they're still a little bit wet from taking them out this morning. I've had them for more than a year now, and I really like the fact that they're like so flexible, but they're sort of mid-weight. They're just kind of like the best of every world, you know, because they're super flexible. They've got a mid-height upper, so it's like slightly taller than like a shoe boot sort of setup, but not quite as tall as like a full winter boot. So it's a little bit better for breathability because you don't have, you know, so much material trapping the air down there. And then in terms of the lining, this is why they're called the warm lined. They have a recycled synthetic lining. And normally I don't really like synthetic insulation because it doesn't breathe as well as something like merino wool. But for some reason this works really well, and I think it's because it's so puffy. It looks pretty much like sheep wool, but this puffiness helps move moisture and heat away from your body, but it also insulates you with the leather on the outside. And I haven't even had to treat these after a year, which I'm really impressed by. They look pretty much brand new. There's no tear out anywhere on the seams. The leather looks flawless. So yeah, I'm just like really impressed by them. The stitching is really good as well. I like having a stitched sole on my boots, especially for something with water resistance, because a lot of waterproof boots will have a glued sole, and it's a little bit more secure in the beginning, you know, because you don't have the holes for stitching for the water to come through. But over time they can separate, and I have had that happen on a couple barefoot boots. It is fixable with shoe glue, but you know, I'd rather just have a stitched sole most of the time. In terms of the lacing, you've got typical lace grommets on the bottom of the shoe, and then you've got quick lace loops on the top, which are nice for just kind of like whipping the boot on and off. And then there's a ton of room inside this boot. Like when you remove the tongue, they're very easy to slip on and off, which I like. I don't have to struggle with them. Sometimes when you have higher cut boots, it's like your foot kind of has to be like jammed in there, you know, but that's not the case at all. You can really open them up. And they have a ton of room too. So they have a nice wide toe box, a little bit squared off in the front, which is great. But then because they're a laced boot, you can open them up pretty much as you want to. And this boot could even get into extra wide territory. They've got a good amount of volume. You know, it's kind of medium through here, but then higher volume. If you have higher arches, it should work fine for that. And then in terms of the sole, it's 3.7 millimeters, which is crazy thin for a winter barefoot boot. For any boot, honestly. And then it has a hexagonal tread, which I really like because you can see that like I haven't even cleaned these off and there's very little mud on them, even though when I go for my walks in the morning and in the evening, I go through this really muddy yard. But I guess something about the hexagonal pattern, the fact that it's just not that deep, you know, it's like the mud just doesn't get caught in there. Like the only muddy spot really is like right here in the middle, you know. But another thing I like about the hex tread that Vivo does is that they split it right here. So you can see that that just adds even more flexibility. But Vivo's gotten really, really good with their rubber. Even some of my original Vivo shoes have basically kept going even after 7 years. But I don't know, it's grippy. You can see that it holds onto my finger there. But it also, you can hear, it doesn't sound like a 3.7 millimeter tread, you know what I mean? Something super thin. So you get like this really amazing ground feel when you're walking. But then there's also protection. I've never had this boot or any of the boots or shoes that have a thin sole get punctured anywhere. And I have had that happen with another boot, which we'll talk about. But yeah, one other thing, actually two things that I want to mention for this is that Vivo gives you a thermal insole. But it has kind of like a space blanket material, which is nice if you're going to be in really, really wet terrain and you want to give a little bit of extra resistance on the bottom of the shoe. But I like to use a wool felt insole. And this is nice because it just insulates the bottom of your feet, but it also wicks moisture away from your body as long as it's not just completely soaking wet, in which case you might want something a little bit more protective. But it just warms the boot up as well. And then because it's so flexible compared to the thermal, It doesn't add any kind of like rigidity, you know, to the bottom of the boot. And it also softens it up just a little bit. It's like super thin, you know, so it's not gonna affect ground feel, but like walking on pavement, for example, if I'm walking around in like urban conditions, I really like having this because it just makes it, you know, feel like I'm rolling down a little bit more smoothly. And then the other thing that I like to do with the GOBI Winter warmlined is use a pair of Injinji merino wool toe socks, because like when I was growing up, I wore soccer cleats and Adidas Sambas and my toes kind of did this. So now they're still really close together, and it's really hard to change your, you know, your skeleton formation as you get older. So I really like that these spread out my toes because it gets a little more airflow in there. They're super high percentage merino wool, so they're very soft, very breathable, really excellent antimicrobial properties. So they don't smell even after you use them over and over and over again. And then also great temperature regulation. So I can have a layer or two of these. And then if I have the, you know, the puffy synthetic here, it actually works really well. I've gotten the GOBI warmlined or winterized down to 0 degrees. And then probably up around like 60 would be the high for these boots, I'd say, you know, because they do have more water resistance and more insulation. They can get warm if you're getting them too high. But Vivo has a Chelsea boot option and also an uninsulated GOBI boot, which would be a good option if you want something that could work for all seasons, and then you would just need, you know, maybe thicker socks instead of having the built-in insulation in there. But it is nice because then I only have to put on one layer of socks and I'm not like layering up every time I go out, you know. If you want a vegan winter boot option, this is the Henza G. It's cool because it looks like a combat boot. It's even higher than the warmlined from Vivo Barefoot. It is a little bit lower volume. You can see in the front, there's not as much room here. So if you have higher arches, this may not work for you. But they also have a zip version. I think the zip's on the inside, which is really cool. I'd like to test that one at some point because the laces are pretty high, so it is a bit of a struggle. It does take a little extra time having to unlace them and lace them every time. So yeah, zip would be really nice, but inside you've got more of a lightweight synthetic insulation. So I'd say the Vivo warmlined are warmer than the Henza G. But again, if you add a layer or two of socks in there and maybe a insole, if you're going for a vegan version and you don't want a wool insole, you can get a hemp insole or the reflective heat blanket type of setup that Vivo has with the warmlined. In terms of the toe box, it's nice and wide, so similar to Vivo. I would say Vivo has just a little bit more room because the laces go more towards the front, whereas the laces on the G are just a little bit higher. But overall, some good horizontal width in this one. And then the tread is 4 millimeters, so it's also really, really flexible, just like the Vivo GOBI boot. And it has some nice traction. It's mostly a city boot. You can feel that it's light. I think the tread, it's a little bit lighter and I would say slightly less durable than Vivo Barefoot. I did have, like I mentioned, there's a puncture spot right here where I was out on the trail and I caught a thorn that went through there. And luckily, because there is some density in the tread there, it didn't go through, which was nice. But I would say overall, probably a better boot for urban conditions and, you know, maybe some light gravel and stuff like that. But it does give you some nice traction, especially when the boot starts to bend, you know, because there's a bit of depth in there for the lugs. In terms of water resistance, I think the material is really good. I've taken it out into puddles and slush and stuff like that, and it'll stay dry for probably a good hour. It will start to soak through eventually just because it's thin, you know, and it's not completely waterproof. So I'd say the Vivo GOBI boot warmlined is a little more water resistant, but they're both really good. If you want something that's completely waterproof, this is the Blanca Winter boot, and it's got a leather upper, and this is what I was talking about with the glued sole. So this definitely helps with being completely waterproof, but you can start to get a little bit of separation, which you can see there. It hasn't seemed to affect the waterproofing yet, and if it goes a little further, I may add some shoe glue in there. But overall, I really like the waterproofing of these, and these are the warmest barefoot boots that I have because they've got merino wool lining. I think it'd be cool if Vivo added a version that had merino wool, but the trade-off is that it is very warm, so it might, you know, decrease the high temperature of the warm lines. Like with these, I can probably get up to 50, and then it really starts to feel quite warm because you can see it's thick, it's very puffy, so it will wick moisture away from your body well, but it'll also warm your feet up quite a bit. These have a extra wide toe box. However, because of the insulation in there, I would say they probably fit pretty similar to the GOBI boot warmlined, because the insulation takes up quite a bit of room. And the only thing I really don't like about this boot is just kind of like the stringiness of the laces. You know, like you've got this pretty rugged boot, but then you've got these laces which feel light, and they haven't torn, I mean, to their credit. But yeah, I feel like they could just use something that just feels a little more sturdy. They do have quick laces up here, or quick grommets for on and off. And it's about the same height as the GOBI warmlined, so kind of like that mid-height, which is nice. Sometimes you can get snow in there if you're going through like really deep powder, and that can also happen with the warmlined. The Henza G is nice because it's a bit taller, so I never get snow coming in here. That's just something to consider. But in terms of the tread, I think it's 8 millimeters, and also really flexible because they've done a good job of like cutting, you know, the lugs and not making them too thick. So they've got a lot of traction here, and they are angled in the front and the back. So going up or going down hills, it really bites into the snow or slush or mud. But also they've got horizontal lines, so some really good flexibility that way as well. Even though it's a thicker tread, it actually feels pretty flexible and light and springy. And part of that is because the lugs actually, you can see when you press down on them, they really bend, you know? So even though it's a thicker tread, it rolls along really smoothly for urban terrain as well. Although it does feel a bit heavier than the other two. Like I mentioned before, there's also a GOBI Chelsea version, which you can slip straight on. This is basically the same thing as the warmlined, except there's no insulation in there, so it's good for all season use. Same 3.7 millimeter tread. It's just a little bit more snug in the toe box because it doesn't have laces, you know, but leather will stretch just a little bit over time. So that's the Chelsea. And then one last option, if you want something that's just a little bit lower, would be the Zero. This is the Denver leather. They also have a canvas if you want a vegan option, which is also really good. I like the look of this boot. It's kind of like simple and modern, but also classic, you know. It's got a little bit of side support here, which is nice for hiking to prevent your foot from slipping back and forth. It's got a little more structure, this version does, than the canvas. You can feel that like just in the top a little bit, especially when you first get them. You know, there's just a little bit of rigidity compared to the other boots that we've looked at. And then on the inside, it's got a synthetic lining, so, you know, medium warm, and the breathability is not quite as good as wool or as the synthetic faux shearling that Vivo Barefoot has on the warmlined, but a little more rugged laces here, which is nice compared to something like the stringy Blanca ones. Has some protection around the back, and then it's a 5.5 millimeter sole, which is a nice kind of like middle of the road, do everything type of sole, where it's got a lot of really good flexibility, but also you can hear some very good firmness. Zero has a 5,000 mile warranty on their shoes, so they're not messing around with the tread. And there are a lot of good features I like on this tread. So they split here and here, so it gives a lot of really good vertical flex. And then they have these chevron shaped lugs. So when you're going up a hill, they kind of grab like that, and then they're in the reverse direction on the back. So you get a little more hold there. And then also this area is closed off. The lugs are a little bit wider, so you get more protection for your heel going on rougher terrain. A good wide toe box. It does get a little tapered here. I wish this was more squared off, but generally speaking, there's quite a bit of room, and you can open it up wider with the laces. A lot of volume on the top as well. And then one last thing to mention with this boot, I think that the waterproofing is not so great out of the box. It feels like a softer suede type leather, so I've yet to treat these, but I do suspect that it will help a lot with the waterproofing once I put some wax on there. All right, so that's my long-term review of the Vivo Barefoot GOBI boot warmlined and friends, but if you'd like to support the channel, you can shop at the referral links down below. Browse and filter more products with the shoe finder tool at my website barefootwear.org, or watch my zero drop transition video to learn more about barefooting. Finally, if you have a question about the Vivo Barefoot GOBI boot warmlined or about barefoot shoes in general, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Peace.